Good morning, everybody. My name is Mayra Buvinic with CGD, and actually I also work with the UN Foundation. I divide my time. I'm really glad that you're all here, and welcome to everybody, because this is a very important topic that we're talking today, and it's how the MDBs track gender equality. And just let me say that it's a very important topic and it's a very challenging one. It's important because if it's done well, I think that the most important thing of it is not the issue of accountability in terms of what the banks are doing, which is important, obviously, but is that we learn. We learn about what works and what doesn't work. And the banks, in particular the MDBs, I think, are an amazing environment to really learn what works in terms of gender issues and gender mainstreaming. They are the institutions who are doing the large projects and the large lending where we can really learn about what works. So that's why it's very important. Why it's very challenging, it's a really challenging topic because, unlike infrastructure or transport, mainstreaming gender issues, you can have standalone projects, you can have mainstreamed projects, and you also can have the issue of the unintended impacts of gender, of projects on gender, and then having to devise some kind of standards to avoid that. So we have both standalone mainstream impact and unintended impacts, and we have to measure all those. So that's why it's so challenging. It's also very challenging because there's still a lot of misperceptions about what gender equality is all about. There's a lot of resistance still, particularly in client countries, and there are very differing expectations from donors, staff in the institutions and client countries. So it is an important topic, it's a challenging topic, and in practice, I think up to now, although we have improved dramatically, there has been little, the evaluations have not been really as satisfactory and as rich as one would hope that they would be. There has been quite a bit of bean counting, unfortunately, but things are improving. So I think that that's why we call this meeting today, to encourage a conversation and really sort of to continue to improve and learn from each other, to really highlight the importance that it is of really tracking and measuring gender equality in the MDBs for the insights that it can give us in terms of what works and what doesn't work. Before I turn to the panel, I just want to say that the CGD, my colleagues, Charles and Megan, did a little review of the World Bank in terms of tracking their performance. And that's part of why this meeting came around, because after they did this paper, we all started talking about it and realizing that there was so much else that we could talk and learn. And then we encountered, by chance, it was a very fortuitous coincidence that the MDB's gender groups were meeting in Washington, D.C. And I do have to thank the IDB and Andy Morrison in particular for facilitating our interaction with the MDBs and the gender groups. And they decided that they were willing to extend their stay for an extra day to come here and join in this conversation. So thank you, Andy. Thank you, the IDB, and thank you, obviously, all the gender advisors in the MDBs. So I'll turn to the panel, and let me introduce the panelists. And I will start with Michaela Bergman. Michaela is the Chief Counselor on Social Issues and the Director of the Gender Team at the EBRD. She's a social anthropologist, and what I didn't know, but she's also a lawyer. Karen Mathewson, she's a senior advisor of the Office of the U.S. Executive Director at the World Bank Group. So she's a very important constituency for these kinds of evaluations. And before that, Karen was the head of the MDB group at the U.S. Treasury. Andy Morrison, he is the chief of the Gender and Diversity Division at the IDB. Andy is an economist. He once even was a professor of economics. And actually, we just found out he could have been a professional tennis player, but he gave it up for economics. And Nick York. Nick is the director of country, corporate, and global evaluations of the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank. And before that, Nick was the evaluation guy, the evaluation person at DFID. So I think he brings incredibly interesting experience from one of the agencies that has been excellent on gender issues in development. So I will ask questions, and then we hope to have some time for discussion with the audience. And I will start with you, Michaela. And you know, the EBRD is more like the IFC than the World Bank. But tell us a bit sort of what kind of systems the EBRD has put in place to track performance on gender equality.
Okay, so I'll start. The first, at the project level, we track for transition impact, which because we're a transition mandated institution, all of our projects have to fulfill certain transition criteria, of which gender is one of them. So that is tracked, and that's tracked through the whole life of the project. From the environmental and social perspective, you're looking at certain performance indicators, and gender is one of those throughout its various policies. And then results matrix are also tracked when we've got technical cooperation. Then you go up another level, and we have, from the banking, which is where we make our investments, the bankers are tracked for how much they do on gender, how many of their investments have a gender component or focus. We now also have a management scorecard. So all departments have to report on how they are doing in furthering gender equality within the operations. I am talking only about operations here, not about what we're doing internally. And then institutionally, our executive committee also has to report from each of the divisions on what they're doing. And that is part of three main things that they report on, which includes obviously annual business volume or investments, strategic initiatives of the bank. So there's a sort of an accountability. So we're looking both at what we do at the project level, but also how the institution is incorporating gender and working towards improving or mainstreaming gender.
Do you sort of get at the quality of the work done? And if so, how do you?
Okay, so we have an evaluation. EBRD is relatively new to doing this. So it's all been much more formalized now since our strategy was approved in December. I would say that the lifetime of the projects, we're still not really there. We know what we've done, but that's been quite piecemeal. I would say it's on the tens of projects rather than on the hundreds. We know where we've made institutional changes, say, for example, changing policies or government laws. We know when we've changed corporate practices or practices of our employment, but we haven't got a big body of data yet, but we're building that. But we've tried to set up a framework so that we can actually report on it in a meaningful way. But I wanted to just say one thing. You talked about that the tracking is important to know what works and what doesn't work. But I also think it's a really important tool to change the behavior of the organizations we work in. So because we track the gender, track what's done, EBRD employees, a certain percentage of their salary is performance-based. So whether or not they have actually had projects that include gender and have done well will reflect in their pay, basically. And that is how we motivate. So we use the tracking both obviously to know what we're doing in the output, but also we use it as a way to really start getting people to think about it.
That's really interesting. We will continue to that, but let me turn to Andy Morrison now at the IDB. And I think that the IDB is quite unusual or unique in that you really have a whole set of policies to measure unintended impacts and build safeguards and standards. Can you talk a bit about that? How do you do that?
Sure. The IDB's gender policy has 3 components. I will try. I've lost my voice after 2 days of the Global Gender Summit, but I'll do my best. So the IDB gender policy has 3 components, and 2 of them are not surprising. The first 2 is the policy commits us to mainstream gender, and we have metrics that are actually quite similar to what EBRD has discussed. The second thing the policy commits us to do is to look for opportunities to invest in projects whose principal objective is promoting gender equality or women's empowerment. The third part of our policy is, I think, quite unusual, as Mayra said, and that's the safeguard component. And the policy goes and identifies 5 areas in which unintended impacts are most likely to show up. Things like land and housing titling, if joint titling isn't done. Things like rural roads projects, where there's high risk of sex trafficking and in association with that. And so our safeguards department, which is in charge of looking at all the bank safeguards, includes the gender safeguard as one of its safeguards. Last year, they identified 41 loans out of 277 that they reviewed as having potential negative impacts on gender equality. And on a subset of those, we're still not achieving 100% coverage. It's a challenge for us. On a subset of those, team members from this safeguards division work with teams to work on mitigation measures. I'll just give you one concrete example. There was a project with waste pickers on the Pacific coast of Colombia. And the team detected that the way the project was designed, female waste pickers, which were a significant proportion of the beneficiaries, were likely not to be fully included in the project. And so they took measures to make sure the female waste pickers would be included. It's a work in progress. I think one of the themes that I hope comes out in this panel is the balance of carrots and sticks to promote gender mainstreaming in our institutions. I'm a firm believer in carrots. I think that our proactive mainstreaming efforts and our efforts to invest in projects whose principal objective is to promote gender equality is probably going to get us further in the long run than a safeguard, do no harm approach. But I think the do no harm approach is a useful complement.
But as you said, these are sticks, the new do no harm approach. How do you sort of avoid the gender policing?
First of all, I never wear a uniform. So I'm going to talk a little bit about carrots and then talk about the balance between carrots and sticks. Like EBRD, the IDB has promotion of gender equality in its personnel reviews. That's a carrot. It's also a stick, but it's mostly a carrot. We have had off-the-top financing to dispatch expert consultants in areas with little history of gender mainstreaming. So the IDB over the last 2 or 3 years has, and I'm really proud of my colleagues, has made really rapid progress in infrastructure sectors. And it's not that the infrastructure sectors didn't want to do this, they just didn't have any idea how to do this. And once they know how to do this, our transport sector now has 50% of its loans with actions to address gender issues and address them pretty seriously. But we have, regarding how do we avoid being labeled as a gender police, it's quite clear at the IDB that the people who do the safeguards are the safeguards people. They do the environmental safeguards, they do the resettlement safeguards, they do the gender safeguards. So they're the police. They wear the uniforms. We in the Gender and Diversity Division, our consultants who are embedded in other divisions, are there to work collaboratively and try and add value. So we've tried to, I guess, what's the term, ring fence the policing function with people who are already identified as police.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Nick, one of the issues to measure and track and through the independent evaluation group, and I suppose that this is the same in terms of environmental issues. We have the standalone projects for gender equality, and those are easy to measure, right, relatively. But how do you track mainstreaming gender into the portfolio of the bank? And how can the bank do that well?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mayra, for inviting us. We've actually recently done quite a bit of work on checking how well the mainstreaming is working in the World Bank Group. My colleague Elena Bardazi, who's here at the front, and others have done, and Disha Zaidi, who's sitting a couple of rows back, have helped to do work on understanding how well these corporate systems actually do mainstream. And it's quite revealing. I should start by saying that there's been a lot of work to raise the profile of gender and to take it forward in the World Bank Group in the last maybe 3-4 years, and probably way before that when you were doing the leadership there. But so we work really closely with Karen Groen on trying to improve the monitoring and evaluation systems. The IEG is independent, so it's not our responsibility to run the systems, but we do assess them. And we've looked at gender very specifically recently. So a couple of the things that come out is that, the bank is pretty good at looking at the entry point, the gateway, and that happens. But on this point about carrots and sticks, I'm not sure that then leads into quality and real implementation and integration into behaviours. I think that's much more uneven, and we've identified that. I'm sure Karen would agree with that. The new gender strategy is intended to try and push that and the cross-cutting service area in the World Bank Group. But I think if you try and reflect about why that's the case, task team leaders in the World Bank Group are very busy, and they have a lot of other pressures. So I think that it's all too easy for them to say, well, we'll just tick the box of gender once we've got the flag there, once we've been through the process of appraisal that we have to actually follow it through, ensure quality, outcomes, proper theory of change. All that is where the issues are. I didn't used to work in development, and so I have an advantage of seeing what it's like to come into these issues new, and the disadvantage of not having known much about it. And I remember very clearly the point at which understanding why gender is important changed my willingness to put effort into it. So I think part of the issues is about getting people to really own and understand the issues rather than just the systems. The systems only get you so far.
You were working at DFID, and DFID has always been, a front runner on gender equality. Are there sort of systems that DFID was doing that the bank should do, or?
DFID's a front runner, and I'm sure my colleagues in DFID won't mind me saying this, is a front runner on thinking. It's not necessarily a front runner on implementation.
Ooh.
Well, it's true. It's absolutely true. And we actually evaluated DFID's gender strategy. It was about 3 years into my 10 years there, and it was in a dreadful state. There was very little thinking on gender at that point. It shifted when the politics shifted. Hilary Benn, the Secretary of State at the time, really made gender a priority. And that's when you saw the shift. So people respond to bureaucratic incentives. They know where the power lies. After that, it changed, and I must say it was pretty good by certainly 5 years ago. But the same issues arise. People are interested in gender and will implement and deal with it. People who are not interested will do it because they have to. So it's trying to reach those task team leaders. I'm not saying anything you don't already know, but it remains an issue. So what we've done is tried to develop tools and things that will help people. And one very practical issue that's come up is this issue of beneficiaries, counting beneficiaries. It's quite interesting in a practical sense. The World Bank Group's corporate scorecard requires beneficiaries to be counted. But what does that mean? It's very easy for the project managers to say we'll count intended beneficiaries or we'll count the target population of the project and divide that by 2. Now, these two things are not very useful because the real issues are who actually gets the impact. And by looking into that properly, using impact evaluation of households, for example, or proper qualitative work on intra-household dynamics and looking at the intervention in more depth, you can reveal a lot, including getting a lot of information about poverty and distributional impact along the way. So I think that's where we need more work.
Right. Thank you. Karen, you sit at the board and sort of you are really, I think, one of the types of people that these reports are written for. What do you like on these reports and what do you think should be done more or better from the World Bank perspective?
Yeah. So you're referring to the IEG reports in particular?
Well, in general.
In general. So the IEG reports really are, just starting with them, they're very helpful. And to a certain extent, they confirm a lot of what I think many of us suspected. And Karen Groen will probably talk to this more later, but the mainstreaming, I think, allows for sort of a sprinkling. And we're actually moving more away from that term and more into integration. I think that helps foster an important change in mindset where you can't do a real check-the-box exercise if you're serious about integration, and also about being more strategic. And what I mean by that is when identifying at the outset, when you're working on a country diagnostic, where are the constraints and the gaps, and then which ones do you really need to address in order to and prioritize in order to meet a country's development objectives, and then take them on in a coherent and aggressive way. I think the new gender strategy goes a very long way in that direction. So these are helpful, but I wanted to talk for a minute about the corporate scorecard, because at the board, a lot of us look at the corporate scorecard as a way to measure bank performance. This is a very, very high order scorecard, and we met a few months ago to talk about the latest scorecard, and it showed, I think, that almost 100% of country assistance strategies or frameworks cover gender, which gets a rousing one-handed clap for me, because that is a policy requirement, you know? So that is not a sign of success. The question is, well, how many operations are there? What are the quality of the indicators? You know, are they measuring outcomes or outputs? What kind of resources are being put behind these operations to ensure that within the practices, or what we call the global practices, the operational departments, you have expertise? Karen runs a very small operation. She cannot possibly be managing projects all over the institution. And then what kind of learning and then knowledge is going on that can help feed into these operations? And those are the questions that as a board member I am particularly preoccupied with and focused on. And on the learning and knowledge, for example, we have, you know, not only Nick's group, but gender innovation labs. And these are terrific, but they're ad hoc. They depend heavily on outside resources, on donors, you know, like, of course, the Nordics, God bless the Nordics. And the bank itself puts very limited resources into these things. And I think this is so important, because not only does it teach you how to do gender better and gender right, but it really helps on the demand side. And, you know, Maya mentioned this at the outset. Another real challenge for us at the board is that everyone talks about what makes the bank great, one of its comparative advantage, one of its really was part of its DNA. It's demand driven. You don't tell the client what you want. Yeah, that's true, but you can strongly influence it. It's like you want to buy a car, but you go in and somebody can convince you, airbags are really a wonderful thing. You should pay extra for these, or seatbelts. And the first time around, you might have resisted, but now you know. You've got the data. Yes, you absolutely want those things, right? And so part of it is educating your interlocutor. And again, that goes back to the learning and the knowledge and having the staff, the operational staff, care about the issue, who don't see it as a phase, who themselves believe how important it is. And I think people like Christine Lagarde, quite frankly, have been really terrific at putting a spotlight on how important gender is to growth objectives, to the bank's twin goals. So I'll
Great.
stop there.
You've sort of touched on three very important issues: indicators, resources, and clients. Let me ask you the question, because all of it ties really to resources. If you're going to have more meaningful indicators, you need more data, you need you need the gender labs.
Yeah.
Who is going to pay for all this?
So I'm glad that you raised the issue. I was just chatting with Karen about this yesterday. So look, okay. So the real answer is, first of all, again, this does come back to the demand side, right? Because you want the client to say, I want this operation to include, say, to address gender-based violence, say if it's a fragile state, or safe transport, maybe if it's Brazil. There's a jillion examples. So that's first, because then the money that they're borrowing will go directly to this. So that is the first threshold. Within the institution, I think there is an incredible challenge of the budget and finding appropriate resources. And globally, I think that the report that Nick was talking about last year noted that something like 1% to 3% of all budgets, on average, really, of country budgets address gender. It's a tremendously under-resourced area. And I'm glad you mentioned data, because this is a particular area of concern for us. You can't possibly address constraints unless you have data that really show how significant they are. And you can't track progress without data. And the bank tends to rely very heavily on household surveys, and they simply ask for the head of household, and that does not help us here. So we're pushing this very, very hard. One area is within the IDA context. So just in the event that you guys aren't familiar with this, World Bank has sort of a funny split where we have a separate process for financing the poorest countries, the non-creditworthy countries. We call them IDA, International Development Association. Three adjectives in search of a noun, as I like to say. And then I guess association is sort of a noun. And then the IBRD side, and that is funded through earnings and debt issuances. And so on the IDA side, we have a little more flexibility because there's a big, big fundraising effort every 3 years. And there's one going on right now. And we and the capitals can say, look, we want some of these resources put towards gender specifically. And in fact, I think that Nick's report pointed to the fact that the bank does somewhat better, has a history of doing somewhat better in IDA countries, and I really think that's why. On the IBRD side, the budget process it's very competitive, and there are not line items for these particular areas. So I would say this is an area that needs a lot of work.
Great. Michaela, this carrots and for performance, really very impressive. Has it yielded results?
It does. On a little by little, it does cumulatively make a difference. I just want to go back. We also we have the safeguards, because all the gender is mainstreamed in all of our safeguards. And so the social specialists are the ones that identify where there are risks and also identify opportunities as they're doing their social due diligence. So we have I think it has made a difference in an institution like the EBRD. where people tend to be motivated by doing the deals, by doing the business. And also, you see it as an opportunity. You make a better investment. And, people generally are working at these institutions because they want to do, people at EBRD could be working for an investment bank, pure and simple. So they're there at the EBRD because they want to make a difference. And if they can make a difference, not only relation to reducing CO2, for example, or something, but they can also make a difference, then, as long as it's not going to be onerous for them. So that is the whole issue. And the way we've set it up at EBRD is that, yes, it's their responsibility, but we have a gender team who supports them. So that's the way we've done it. It's not more paperwork. It's not more bureaucracy for them to deal with. We work with the clients. So that's the way we've made it very easy for them. That was the strategy. And I think that it has made a difference. I mean, my colleague here, Itzi, was only telling me she had an email exchange with somebody. They're talking about, I don't know if it was a train project or something in Morocco. And he said, well, we've already got our rating for transition impact. We don't need to do gender because everybody's right, yeah? But, and then, it's your own, but it's going to be on your scorecard and, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So, yes, it does. Because in the end, people are humans and they respond to incentives. And I think that the more people do it, then the more people want to do it. That's the other thing. People want to join the club of doing it. And that's what we found. And then also very interesting, competitive between, projects in certain sectors. So, you have a power sector project and they manage to do equal opportunities, which is how we probably work in the power sector. And then, they've done it, well, we want to do it too. So that's how it's worked, I would say.
So, and do you have sort of same kind of incentives for other areas, for other topics,
well,
or not?
So it's a bit nerdy, EBRD, but every investment has to satisfy, reach a certain level in transition impact. And that is about making a systemic change to an economy so it's moving towards a market economy. So, and that can be garnered by changing business practices. There are new corporate governance, numerous, and gender is now one of them. So, yes, there are other things, and now gender is one of those. It's a component of transition because we believe, and we've convinced everybody to believe, that you don't have a well-functioning market economy if you only use the resources of half the population. It's not efficient. So that's the EBRD argument for it. So yes, there are other incentives, but this is another one. And as I said, you can have a rating of satisfactory, good, and excellent. And people want to maintain that excellence. They want to get to excellent. They often have good, but they want to get to excellent because that's.
And how do you have the issue of gender policing that you need to deal with, or?
So there's the gender policing. I also have another hat on, as you know. I'm the Chief Counsel for Social Issues, so I'm looking at resettlement and labor issues, particularly in non-discrimination in the workplace. So my view on safeguards has always been to, yes, of course, the last resort, you're there with a uniform this time, Andy. But my approach has always been, this is an issue. Let's try and sort it out because actually, if we don't deal with the issue, it's going to take longer to prepare the project. You're going to have CSOs screaming at you. You're going to have whatever. So, it's not a police per se, but it's a gentle encouragement. And I think that generally works. And I think people now are, much more familiar with the fact that, women don't always have equal titles to the land. So in terms of compensation, you've got to make sure that they have equal opportunities to any benefits that are coming. I think people are getting better at that. Stakeholder engagement is another issue. How many meetings for these big projects are done at times when women can't participate and actually involve, and then they're not consulted? I've also seen on huge projects I've done with these big pipelines where they have CSR and job opportunities and lots of other things, and they were only offered to the men. People are getting much better at, I think, understanding that. So it's yeah.
Andy, on the IDB side, do you have the issue of the problem of resources for this kind of? I shouldn't even ask.
I would be
right?
lying. I would be lying if I said no.
How do you think it can be overcome, if any?
Yeah, this is obviously something I've thought a lot about, and the IDB has a problem that the World Bank doesn't have in terms of raising outside resources, because many of the traditional donors for gender now consider Latin America and the Caribbean to have graduated. On everything. Not just on gender, on everything. And consequently, we have a trust fund that funds work on gender, on indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants. And the lion's share of money that's gone into that trust fund has come from IDB ordinary capital. So the IDB is putting its own money in its trust funds to finance this work. And I can't remember the exact number, but it's at least a 5-to-1 ratio of IDB's own money versus donor money. And in an era in the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, of fiscal crisis, where the bank's very conscious of costs, there's concern about how much money is going to be available for trust funds going forward. I don't have World Bank envy frequently. I worked in the World Bank. I know the institution too well to have, full-blown World Bank envy. But one thing I think the World Bank does exceedingly well is their gender innovation labs. I think they're remarkable. And we have tough conversations with clients. One of our two flagship programs on gender equality is Women's City, which many of you know, which was born in El Salvador. It's the Government of El Salvador project, integrated services to women. And we wanted to do a randomized control trial of this. This was the first time we were doing this. And we proposed to the government of El Salvador that we include the impact evaluation in the loan. And they very correctly said, the knowledge about whether this works is a regional public good. Why should the taxpayers of El Salvador pay for knowledge that's going to benefit the region and the world? And so we went and we financed this with trust fund resources. We're currently undertaking something like 9 rigorous evaluations in the area of violence against women. 7 of them are randomized control trials. All of them are financed via our trust fund. And most of those are financed with IDB's own resources. So are resources a constraint to learning? Absolutely. Are we investing heavily in impact evaluations? Yes. Could we do a lot more with more resources to learning? Yes, because I think this panel may talk about this more. We all have mechanisms to look at learnings from projects. The IDB has the bureaucratic names, project monitoring reports, project completion reports. My colleague Tracy Betts can talk about and more knowledgeably about this. They track all indicators that are in the results matrices of projects. And if we have a gender indicator in a results matrix, those are tracked. About 2/3 of the time they're tracked in terms of truth in advertising. But that doesn't give us the depth of learning that we need. We need impact evaluations to do that, and funding's a constraint. Thanks, Mayra.
Okay. Nick, you were mentioning about counting beneficiaries. Can you talk a bit more about that? And I mean, it's sort of been counting in a sense, but probably it's very meaningful as well because it has not been done before. And how is it being done? What are the issues with it?
Well, as I say, it's a requirement, so people are doing it, but it's not actually getting to the real concept of impact. If you don't mind, I'd rather sort of pick up on the impact evaluation end of it and bring that in because I think that helps. So as Andy said, there's some very good work going on impact evaluation in these areas, and the Gender Innovation Lab has about 50 impact evaluations going. Just to give an example, adolescent girls in Liberia, they were able to show high income effects from training girls for jobs, which showed it was a good incentive, a good investment. And then they managed to show that you got higher returns from the entrepreneur training than the wage labor training, and then that changed the design of the project going forward. Now, if we can continue to build the public good of that sort of evidence and bring it into the decision making, then it can actually directly impact the design of the project as it's being implemented. That's a great way of getting at the real beneficiary impact, because you do need rigorous methods. it's good that we're in the Centre for Global Development, and I wish Nancy Birdsall was here, because the 3IE institution that they basically created the momentum for, and several years ago now, is really thriving and has created, what, about 60 impact evaluations by now at least, and many more to come. And together with other initiatives, particularly DIME, the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund, the Innovation Labs, are probably, well, JPAL as well, of course. The position we're now in on evidence is quite a lot stronger than it was when I was discussing this with CGD back 10 years ago. So I think a lot of credit goes to CGD for seeing that gap, particularly Ruth Levine, who pushed that very hard. And now we're in better shape. So it is a question of continuing to build on that and making sure that the evaluation and evidence systems fit together. Now that's not so easy because frankly the impact evaluation community doesn't always talk to the rest of the evaluation community, and the evaluators are not always so good at feeding into the operational decision making. So that's something we're spending a lot of time on trying to think how that can improve. I think if you spoke to Arianna Legavini at DIME, she would say that they're very, very focused on that feedback loop now. And this is where we can really make a difference. Marcus Goldstein, who sort of briefed me on the Gender Innovation Labs before this meeting, emphasizes the use and learning aspects very much. That's what they're trying to do. This is not IG's work, by the way. I can't take any credit for this. I'm just reporting their good work on this.
Can I, before sort of Tony, can I ask you something else and from your experience, not only with the gender mainstreaming, but when you evaluate, I mean, what the bank is doing, how do you attribute things to the bank versus the country and the client? Oof. I mean, because a lot of
I'm
times...
so glad you got that question.
No, the bank, the bank sort of is trying to do well, and then you get just pushback at the country level. And it, and it can be vice versa too.
Well, there's a long technical answer about the attribution issue, which I won't bother you with. But I mean, I think the end result is you tend to look at things on a very project basis, and look at the impacts of the project. Very often we don't get the impacts of the project; we mainly get the outputs or the outcomes. But to the extent you look at it on a project basis, you assume that project is in some sort of bubble. You end up doing that. You end up focusing inwardly at just the project. Now we all know that's technically and conceptually and not that meaningful, but that's what ends up happening. Whereas impact evaluation can actually do the opposite. It starts from the household end and says what differences does it make to the household, and that's what matters. It doesn't really matter whether the World Bank made a difference. What matters is whether the household felt a difference from the interventions, which are always partnerships anyway. So I get the question, but in a way I'd rather ask the question about what the impact on the household is. You can then make rules of thumb assumptions, based on the funding that went in. DFID used to have a neat trick of saying the impact of DFID's work is at least as much as our proportionate share of funding, on the basis that their creativity and innovation always meant that they must have leveraged other people's effects more. And then I got to the World Bank and found actually they think the same. So I think any donor thinks that they're leveraging other people's money more than their proportionate share. I see it more like, I've used the analogy of a rugby scrum. Does anybody know how rugby works? Yeah. Okay, so rugby is a bit like American football. You're trying to get the ball over the line. But sometimes you end up with 10 guys, or women now, all scrum together, and they're all holding the ball. The ball's in there in the middle, and the ball gets over the line somewhere. But nobody knows who scored. You don't even know if you did score until about 10 minutes later when they've reviewed all. So I think it's like that. I mean, what the World Bank and DFID and others are a part of that scrum, and the evaluators are somewhere in there as well.
I really like that analogy of development as a rugby scrum.
Well, but I mean, sometimes you get solo tries, and that's very clear. You see the effect. But most of the time, it's not like that, and it doesn't really matter because you still score. Well, it matters whether you score.
What is called and measuring. Let me just have a last question for the panel, and then we'll turn to some questions from the audience. And the question is, this panel was described as what works and what needs changing. So can we just go a quick round and tell me what you think needs changing, the one thing that you think needs changing in your institution or more generally?
Can I start with that one?
Yes, you can start.
So I think there need to be, and Nick mentioned this, in IDB, there needs to be better feedback loops between the serious impact evaluation work we're doing in areas and the monitoring systems. And there needs, I think, to be agreement on key areas where we want to generate knowledge and a prioritization of it. Because I think, given limited resources, it would not be realistic to say we're going to generate deep knowledge on issues of gender impacts across all sectors right now. But if we can prioritize and identify sectors, and I think in IDB it's probably infrastructure, and we can ask interesting questions about what kind of tweaks, what kinds of changes to infrastructure projects maximize those projects' abilities to promote better gender outcomes, and at the same time improve our downstream monitoring systems so that they align with some of the impact evaluation work. I think that's a big, big challenge.
Okay, Karen.
Okay, that was a multi-part answer, so I'm going to do two answers.
I'm sorry, I was not good modeling.
Okay, so look, the easy answer, and I think it was very obvious from my remarks, is the resources without question. This is a bank, and the bank needs to put its money where its mouth is. I'm going to say something else, a little bit controversial, potentially not for you guys in the room, but for others. We need a female head of an MDB in the worst way, and we need more women at the boards of these institutions. It is outrageous. I think there are, out of, more than 50 of us, there's maybe 13 right now, both in the number 1 and 2 positions. And this is a real problem because this is something that governments appoint the board members. And I really think there needs to be a message every time a government is coming to a turnover point of saying, we have to lead by example. Really want you to start sending women to represent your constituents. So that would be my big request.
Michaela.
Ooh, well, let me say, I absolutely agree with Karen on her last point. I think one of the challenges is when we're asking a company, a private sector company, to do X and Y, new human resources policies and non-discrimination and outreach, and they say, and what do you do at EBRD? And it's sometimes difficult. And so I do think the institutions have to look at where they're coming from, because then I think you can honestly and with more, say what you're doing. I think it's also, the other thing is resources, but resources in terms of, having people who can, we get the data to do the evaluation, and also understand that I think that when you're evaluating gender impact, it's not something that happens that you can say in a year. I think you need to track what differences you're making. So where we're trying to change corporate practices, for example, if everything changed within a year, I would have suspicions it's not sustainable. So I think it's about making the resources available over a period of time to track what systemic changes you're making, both in terms of laws or, or what you're doing, is it changing the marketplace, is a sector changing? And so it's about allocating resources in a sustained way, not all at the beginning and not also at the end, but also to track afterwards.
Thank you. Nick?
Actually, I know I've been moaning about DFID. The last 3 directors in the World Bank from DFID have been women, so that's one thing they do well, actually. But just
and the Nordics.
Yeah.
And they don't send a woman to EBRD, and it's just down the road, so there you are.
I was there last week, so thank you for hosting us. Actually, at that meeting that we had last week with the evaluation units of the multilateral banks, which was very interesting, an issue came up, and let me just share it because I think it does help to answer part of this, which is a very different set of views about priorities here. Funny enough, we ended up with 4 men arguing that gender should be a big priority in evaluation, and 4 women saying no. Gender should be, evaluation should be objective, and it's not about advocacy. So gender's another priority, but it's only one of them. So that really made me think, because there were very strong views on this. I won't say who said what, but there was not agreement on how important gender was and how evaluation and evidence should help to build that. Now, I think one of the ways we can do that is to look at the issues and the evidence. It seems to me that if we're about poverty reduction, then gender is a preeminent issue, and it's not just another issue. So I actually heard somebody say in that discussion, no, I don't want to give priority to gender because I might want to give priority to poverty reduction. And I thought, well, that does not make sense. So that leads me back to my answer to your question. What is the one thing that changed? I think understanding of why this is important is still very uneven. That affects how people's intrinsic motivations to change things. You can use carrots and financial incentives, but I think in development, intrinsic motivations are far more powerful. So as soon as people get why this is vitally important for poverty reduction, they will put their heart and soul into this more consistently. So how can we change that?
Great, thank you. Open to questions. Please identify yourself and try to be brief. And we'll take a few questions and then we'll go to the panelists. Elena.
Is there a mic or should
There should be a mic.
There's a mic coming.
I have 2.
And Elena, by the way, Elena works with Nick, or really, as it's understood, Nick works with Elena. The Wolf.
So I have 2 quick questions, one for EBRD, Michaela, and one for Andy. I'm familiar more with IFC than EBRD, but one challenge that we encounter in the private sector, mostly 2 challenges. One is really getting to results because your counterpart is always a medium to the final beneficiary. It's a bank, it's a private company, etc. So they themselves don't know, or they don't have necessarily an incentive to collect the data when it's not necessarily convenient for them, or meaning it's not always the case that they get a benefit from the gender equality. That's why we have safeguards, etc. So can you talk a little bit more about the challenges and also in how you validate this information, how you overcome issues of confidentiality that are often some big part, and also your own reluctance in burdening the clients too much with, which are the issues that and the problems that we find at IFC, for example. And for Andy, I was going to pick a little bit about the last thing that Nick said about about the poverty. You are the head of a department that is called Gender and Inclusion. So do you think that making a pitch for gender in the broader context of distributional impacts, inclusion, shared prosperity for us at the bank, etc., it's more strategically convenient in terms of like resources and also motivation of TTLs than focusing on gender in itself, or do you think this risks of diluting the attention or getting back to this tension between we don't want the mainstreaming anymore, but at the same time what we hear a lot is from TTLs, yet another thing to do, and getting into this lack of understanding that is part of the same discussion about shared prosperity. Thank you.
Those were 2 long questions. Yeah, let's take another question and then we'll turn to the speaker. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Lynette Miriti from the African Development Bank. I wanted to ask a question around the linkage of linking gender with safeguards, and wanted to know how you've guarded against gender being limited just to safeguards and mitigation, so that it's not some projects, saying, okay, we're not making any negative impact, so we are fine. as opposed to the project actually advancing gender equality, because that's an issue we are thinking about. Then the other one is sort of a broader question, I think, to all the panelists. Are you seeing the sustained results in gender? If the gender teams and the carrots and sticks were not there, would people still do what they were supposed to do? Would people still mainstream gender if there were no carrots and sticks? Is there traction? Has there been behavior change? Do people actually see that gender is central to development, or is it because it's something we are required to do?
Great. Why don't we turn around and get, these are very substantive questions, and thank you for the good questions, Michaela.
Okay, the first question, Elena. So how do we, let me give you 2 examples of investments. So we have a big program of the Women in Business programs where we lend to partner financial institutions with the twin objectives of them, A, lending to female entrepreneurs, but at the same time, we want the partner financial institution to change its corporate behavior, change some of its processes, looking at how it lends, whatever. So they're tracking, banks track data anyway. What we found is actually surprisingly that even very sophisticated banks, say in Turkey, did not have sex disaggregated data, which was astonishing. Mm-hmm. So this is what we're doing, and that's part of the deal, so to speak, that they do that. And we can track it. It's quite easy to track, and also to go into the bank and see, what are they also doing in terms of their own staffing, because you can see, another example, and their whole raison d'etre for that project actually is to increase their female client base. So they have an interest in tracking data and doing it, and that's what they want to do. Another project where it might seem less evident is a completely different type of project. We were privatizing bus services in the municipality of Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. And we did a survey. It was a very, very early project of when we were working on gender, and we did a survey about what men and women wanted from their new buses. And the women all wanted low-floor buses. Okay, it's not high-tech. But it was going to cost a lot more in the investment. So what the mayor then decided, okay, he was going to halve the number of buses he was going to purchase and see what happened. And their rates of customer service and satisfaction just rose. They had more users, because again, transport companies do track, they want to know how many people are using it. They want more, and they've gone and invested in more buses. So in that sense, and then what has happened, and that's been a whole chain, so then the other municipalities in that region say, oh, we're interested. So you now have Osh doing the same thing in Kyrgyzstan, their municipality doing the same thing. Now, when we're working with these companies, it's not just about the end use of the transport, but we also look at the equal opportunities in the employer. So we're asking, how many women do you employ, but where are they in the decision-making roles? And every year, they have to report on what they're doing. So that's how we track it. So actually, we found not a problem getting data. But then again, it's all about how you've engaged the client, whether they think it's to their advantage. And then some of them want to show you that they're doing really well, because actually they're quite proud of the changes that they've made. So on that sense, that's how we've done it. Should I answer the second question or not, about Lynette's question?
Sure. Briefly, yes.
Okay. I'm always told that I talk too fast, but maybe I'll talk really fast now. So we've always had the safeguards. And then one thing, we mainstream gender into the safeguards to do no harm. And then the approach was that we then had a strategy which looked at what we can do to improve. So one is the safeguards, which make sure that there's no disproportionate impacts or unintended consequences. And then the strategy looks at how we can promote and improve. And they're staffed by different people, so we have the gender team does the strategy, and the social experts generally, but with some support if needed, do the safeguard bit. So we divided them, and we sometimes do the same. So that's how we did it. But I can talk to you more offline on that.
Karen, do you want to reflect on some of the questions or the sustained results?
On the second one, I see safeguards as such a small part of the gender agenda, quite frankly. but I've been thinking about your question about if, what would happen if we didn't have the gender team, and would there still be demand and so forth. And I thought if I was told that Karen's group was being disbanded, I would raise holy hell. Because unfortunately the answer is no.
That must be comforting for Karen.
At least not yet. And the same with climate, right? We have a special climate team because we're still working with clients to persuade them why this issue really, really matters. So we definitely have a ways to go in that area.
So, and despite the fact that, there was a WDR.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I don't agree. I think safeguards are really important because
sorry,
all
didn't mean
our
to s-
projects,
Yeah.
every one of our investments has to comply with a certain level of safeguard. And if that has got gender mainstreamed, you're actually touching a lot of people.
Yeah.
And you are, so I would say I'm not saying it's the most important one, but it's really important in the work that we do.
Nick has.
Yeah, I think we've been looking at this issue in one aspect which may sort of add to the argument. There's direct and indirect effects of projects, of course. And what I tend to find when we're looking at it is that people are very keen on looking at the direct effects, obviously because it's so much easier. And the direct damage a project can do is something you can focus on. But I think the safeguards then only limits you to preventing damage in the immediate vicinity of the project, in a sense, or the direct beneficiaries or people affected. But often what we're trying to do is obviously create much bigger effects. And particularly in the context of budget support, we've been looking at this, and this goes back a number of years for me, people saying to me, why is gender not addressed or mainstreamed in budget support interventions? And my initial view was, well, it doesn't matter so much there, does it? And then when I thought it through, it actually makes a massive difference, because if budget support is about policy reform and changing the way ministries work, for example, then that would have an effect nationally. So I think the point about direct effects can be quite localized, but the full effect can be national. From that point of view, I think it's important to go beyond the safeguards and look at the gender effects more generally. So just on answering the other question, though, obviously my point earlier on was based around the idea that intrinsic motivations are not strong enough yet. So if you took away the specialists, it would get weaker. And certainly 5-10 years ago, I watched that happen. They mainstreamed gender specialists in DFID, and that's one of the reasons why gender went down it's absolutely clear that that was the reason. They decided to get rid of the gender specialist post, put them all in, to mainstream them. And that was not just true in DFID, all the bilaterals got very similar results when they evaluated gender mainstreaming. That doesn't mean to say that would be exactly the same now, but it shows you the risks.
Andy?
Well, Elena, you asked me the question of, since the division that I had is called Gender and Inclusion, should we push the inclusion argument rather than the gender? Well, only in my wildest dreams is my division called Gender and Inclusion. It's in fact called Gender and Diversity. So everyone thinks we work on human resource issues. It's really, it's a bad name. And that's our code at IDB for diversity being indigenous peoples and African descendants. Okay? So, but to answer your question, and we worked together for a number of years, I don't think my answer is going to surprise you. The argument for inclusion of gender themes in projects is never about gender. And it's never about because it's the right thing to do. It's never a rights argument. It's always a development effectiveness argument, because we work in development banks, and that's the argument that carries weight with project teams. I mentioned earlier our transport division at IDB having made rapid progress. They're now at about 50% of their projects doing a serious job on gender. And the reason they're there is because they realize that men and women have differential demand for transit services, which is not news to anybody in this room, but it's news to transport engineers, right?
Absolutely.
And they realize they're designing much better projects. They now know that violence against women is endemic in public transit systems, and that they can increase ridership by addressing it. So none of those are, you should do it because it's the right thing to do. you should do it because you can have much more effective projects. And if you can work to help me change the name of my division, that would be very helpful.
Great. We'll take one or two more questions, and then, yeah, you had a question, and then, sorry. Well, if you're brief, we can take 3 questions.
Arif Zaman, one of the directors of the Commonwealth Business Women's Network, and done some work on reputational risk. So my question is, listening to all of you, and in fact the last couple of days, I get a sense in which is gender now becoming a reputational risk if you don't address it in the way that you're talking about. And the reason I say that is because it then elevates the argument at a more strategic level. And I just wonder whether that's another way of engaging operational people, of engaging board members, and also of highlighting not just the risk danger, but the risk opportunity dimensions of reputation.
Okay, so we'll take Monserrat. You had a question? And then the gentleman there.
Okay. Actually, mine is a comment, so maybe you can take an extra question. It's just a very brief comment, but I think it's added to what you have said. I work from IFC in the World Bank Group. My name is Monserrat. And I just wanted to add to your point, Nick, and also Karen's. I think that you made a very good analogy, talking about selling a car, for instance, and talking about the airbag. I think that is up to the MDBs to bring awareness when we talk to our clients, and to let them, to show them that it's not only good to track whether they have women in their portfolio, because it's just good to count it, but it's also good for them to know your customers. This is just, knowing their characteristics, their features, how they behave financially. And if we can show them that, then we will have less challenges, I think, in actually collecting this data. No? So I think that one thing that should be added is we have, and this is also an answer to Ms. Miriti from the African Development Bank, I think that the incentives are needed as long as we don't show the business case strongly. I think that those will be needed less if we continue working in, this is not only good for, this is not the right thing to do, this is actually good for business. And I just wanted to add that particular comment.
So a third question?
Thank you very much. I'm called Moses Intenga, and I work with Joy for Children. From the panelists, I think many of them agreed that there could be a gap in terms of people understanding the value of gender equality into reducing poverty. And I just want to hear from the bank, the World Bank, if they are doing something first to build the capacity of countries, especially look at the government, look at the contractors. Is there a strategy to empower those people to appreciate the issues of gender? Because while the bank might appreciate that and come up with the policies, they're handing over these policies almost to the government and to the contractors. Is there a strategy that these same values are going to be applied up to the last person? And also then secondly, I also want to ask what the bank is doing to involve the civil society. In the communities where you find the population maybe is illiterate, is not empowered, then perhaps you may need to have another eye to help see that these gender targets are being met. So I don't know if the bank, in this area where the civil society space is being squeezed, is there a strategy by the bank to really work with the civil society to make sure that gender is being achieved? Thank you.
So who wants to, on the bank question, Karen?
So I will just take a little piece of it, and then I'm going to go ahead and punt to Karen Grun, since she's the expert. But I'm really glad you raised the civil society issue, because one reason I think the gender strategy is so strong is because Karen and her team went around the world and engaged in the most exhaustive consultation process, really, that I've ever seen going into a bank group strategy. And I think that really helped root it in a strong sense of ownership among many board members, which sort of gets to the other question about reputational risk. I mean, the answer is I wish there's a reputational risk. I'm not so sure there would be. But it was quite striking that at the board, with the exception of 2 notable board members, and I won't mention them, but you can probably guess where they are, say maybe in the Gulf, for example. It was the consensus and the pace and enthusiasm which we move forward the strategy. Never seen anything like that at any MDB. So I think it really speaks partly to that consultation process. Karen?
Karen, you want to make a statement or your brief?
So, is this on?
Yeah.
Just to be very transparent, I think our colleague was referring to the fact that we had a loan operation in Uganda which we suspended. It was we were accused. It was under a loan to the Ugandan government, which had subcontracted to various companies, and some of the workers in the subcontracted companies engaged in sexual relations with underage girls who were pregnant, and the communities brought a case under the inspection panel. The World Bank moved very promptly. We promptly suspended the loan, and we are in the process of an inspection panel investigation. Probably more importantly than that, this has been a really important opening for the bank to do much more on enhancing our, I don't want to call them safeguards, our standards for mitigation, including bringing in a very big way attention to issues that were not previously recognized. So issues of violence, sexual harassment, appropriate codes of conduct, having redress mechanisms and tribunals for exactly these kinds of cases. But more importantly, beyond that, it's enabled us to not only work with the government of Uganda, and we're in the process of doing a very large operation, and it will not just be Uganda, it will be other countries. The process of looking on the programmatic and upfront side at practices of early marriage, which are considered a form of violence against women, of all types of relationships, and thinking what we could do with countries more broadly to help through education, through health, through social protection, what we can do to actually contribute to reducing these issues. And that's a process of working with civil society and not just the government in thinking about this. And we have very much engaged in Uganda, as well as in other countries, with civil society organizations in this process, because we won't be able to get there unless we do that.
Thank you, Karen. On reputational risk?
As our banks are all, well, mostly rated by the rating agencies, and I'm responsible for helping fill in some of these questionnaires now. And they are asking, amongst not just about human rights, what we're doing, both with our clients and ourselves, and they're also asking about gender, both internally and what we're doing. And if this has been a very interesting exercise because it's changed over the questions are getting more detailed, and they are asking about what we're doing. So now we can say we have a strategy, and so it is in that sense a reputational risk. So, and that has effects and impacts.
Right, Nick.
Just a brief comment on that. I think I understand why the instrumental argument is used instead of the rights-based one. I'm not very comfortable with that personally, and I'm sure many other people might share that, because if you take another example like conflict, we don't have to make an instrumental argument why peace building is a good idea, or discrimination against vulnerable groups on ethnic grounds. We don't need to make an instrumental argument for that. So I do feel uncomfortable about that, but I get why it's done, and I sort of wouldn't presume to say that wasn't a good idea at the time. The only thing I would say is that businesses now are waking up to and have been waking up for a long time actually, to the ethical dimension of their work. And that's ethical, it's not instrumental, it's just ethical. And there are lots of reasons for that, but partly instrumental, of course, which is their customers care about ethics. So it may be that the private sector is actually starting to move more towards the ethical dimension, which is more linked to the rights argument. I just noticed that United Airlines, for example, are really targeting women in their recruitment. There's an instrumental reason for that, but maybe it's not just that. Nobody has mentioned Hillary Clinton. Today is the day that we have, the first female candidate for one of the major parties in the US that's likely to win. It's brilliant.
So on that note, another note of it's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. I welcome you all to have coffee, and we'll be back here in 10 minutes. An applause to the speakers and the panel.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
I enjoyed that. It was good fun.
Oh my God.
Okay.
To make an We'd like to get started with panel 2, so if you could all take your seats, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm until the mic comes on and then deafen you when it does go on. My name's Charles Kenny. I'm a fellow here at the Centre for Global Development working on gender. Been doing so for a little while now. I still consider myself very much in learning mode. I used to say that's just because I just started working on it. Pretty soon I'll just have to admit it that I'm a lousy learner. But it's great to be moderating this panel with a bunch of experts. I hope at least I know enough to ask sensible questions. Going down the line, we have Sonami Tanaka, who is the Technical Advisor for Gender Equity at the Asian Development Bank. She's responsible for overseeing and providing advice on ADB-wide operations in gender equality and women's empowerment. Next to her, we have Basil Jones, who is appointed to the...
I was thinking you were...
It's okay, dear.
Right.
We're good, we're good. Keep going, keep going.
Yeah, keep going. I was thinking...
This is like keep calm.
Too many late nights.
Appointed as the advisor and special envoy to gender and the vice president of the African Development Bank a little over a year ago. Prior to that, he worked for the chief economist on fragile states. And then Karen Graham, who's the senior director of the gender group at the World Bank. Past 7 years, she's economist at residence at the American University and the program on gender analysis. And she was the senior gender advisor at USAID as well. And last but not least, Tracy Betts, who's Division Chief Strategy and Monitoring in the Office of Strategic Planning and Development Effectiveness in the Inter-American Development Bank. She was previously in Uruguay as the IDB representative for 3 years. It's a great panel, and I want to get straight into some questions in no particular order. Let me sit down and find my questions.
Put your paper somewhere.
Oh, wait, it's working. So, Sonami, why not start with you?
Okay.
So the Asian Development Bank, up until just 2 or 3 years ago, didn't have gender, at least in its corporate scorecard. Now it does. Has that made a change to the data you're producing, the impacts you're seeing?
Okay, well, thank you for that question, but I need to actually correct your question because we've had gender mainstreaming in the corporate scorecard since 2009, but until 2009, between 2009 and 2012, it was only for at entry. So looking at the measuring to what extent of ADB's pipeline approved project have had gender mainstreaming within the pipeline projects at entry. But in 2013, there was this new round of corporate scorecard that puts in also the percentage of gender mainstreaming tracking and the gender success rates among the projects that have been completed. So let me just elaborate a little bit on how this system works. So ADB has been adapting since we adopted the policy on gender and development in 1998, a 4-tier category system. Everybody is familiar with the gender markers. So it's a 4-gender categorization system. At least for the public sector, we have been doing that for many years. And the first category is called gender equity theme, so which is about the project's objective or outcome is about narrowing gender gaps. The second is effective gender mainstreaming. The third is called some gender elements, which includes some positive, proactive gender elements, plus the safeguard, addressing gender within the safeguards. And the third one is no gender elements, which typically includes the safeguard, gender elements within the safeguards, but that's something we're supposed to be doing under the policy requirement anyway. So we don't count that as a proactive measure. So what we are looking at during the project implementation and also project at exit, we look at only the top 2 category projects, which do have a project gender action plan. And this project gender action plan includes gender indicators and then targets. For example, what percentage of a women's representation in the committee that is formulated through the water supply projects, or how many women's employment created directly from the projects, and also the series of more qualitative actions that support to achieve these gender targets. So altogether, basically through the project cycle, for the project that were categorized on the first top 2 categories, they need to report at the very end of the project. So the way we evaluate the project's gender mainstreaming elements and the gender equality results are that only among the projects, the 2 top category projects, among that, what percentage was gender success? And then we look at the success rate of the project gender action plan implementation in terms of achieving these numerical targets and achieving the intended gender equality results. So this is how we do this system.
Can I ask what percentage of the total portfolio is in those top 2 groups?
Okay, so at entry, our bank-wide for public sector operation target has been 45%. But we have been actually exceeding this around 52% for the past 3 years. In terms of at completion, so during the project completion reports time, the target by 2016, which is this year, by the end of this year, has been set for at 70%, meaning 70% of project completion reports with the top 2 categories rated gender success. And we have started in 2012 from 47%, meaning only half of the project that had the very strong gender component was actually successful. But we have last year in 2015, we have been improving very significantly at a high speed at 70%. And I wanted to tell you that in a place like ADB, I think every MDB has a different approach to it. In the Asian Development Bank, I think it's an Asian way to do a little bit of policing and then top down and naming and shaming a little bit of, because for us the corporate target works because this is how accountability works and our credibility it works for us. So there's a talk about the reputational risk and using that within the corporate scorecard has been very instrumental for us.
Interesting. So thank you. Basil, given your background in fragile states clearly present some of the most sort of urgent and challenging issues around gender, but they also pose some of the biggest complexities with evaluating and measuring. How do we kind of square that circle, and how are you trying to do that in the AFDB?
Thank you very much, Charles, and also thank to CDG for inviting the bank to be part of this panel. You're right. We know that most of the fragile and post-conflict countries are in Africa, and from the data point of view, countries that are coming out of conflict, they're starting from ground zero. So obviously, there's quite a lot of work and a lot of challenges that you face in fragile and post-conflict countries in terms of how do you now put in a monitoring and evaluation system in terms of your new projects or projects that you are developing. Of course, when we talk about fragility, we have to look at the whole spectrum. There are countries like Somalia and South Sudan, and then you have countries at the other end of the spectrum that are coming out of conflict or making good progress in transitioning, like Rwanda. I think sharing experiences and lesson learned is going to be something that is quite important. For instance, what will it take for a country like South Sudan to become a country like Ghana? Or what would it take for a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo to become like a Senegal? So I think that is a very important component in terms of how do we now put in a system that would help to do some evaluation. Just to borrow from what Sonoma just said, my colleague sitting over there, Lynette, was at the Asian Development Bank. And what we're trying to do in the bank, in the African Development Bank as well, is how do we now institutionalize a gender marker system in terms of categorizing projects that the bank is supporting, especially in fragile states. One of the advantages that the African Development Bank has compared to other MDBs is that we have got dedicated resources, facilities for fragile and post-conflict countries through the ADF. I think was the lady from the ED from, is it Karen, from the World Bank talked about getting money from IDA. In the ADF, we have money that is ring-fenced to support fragile and post-conflict countries. And we can use resources from that facility to help the bank in trying to put in place a monitoring and evaluation system. I think in the African Development Bank at the moment, we're going through a transition. As you know, we have a new president who has just been in office for 1 year, and he's going to focus on 5 key areas, which he calls the high 5. I think I will do some infomercial here. Can you turn to your neighbor and give your neighbor a high 5?
Yay!
So that is the high 5s of the bank.
Yeah, we should have checked that gender was one of the high 5s before we all clapped. But anyway.
Exactly, that's what I'm coming to.
Timing is everything.
And the high 5s are to light up and power Africa, to feed Africa, to integrate Africa, to industrialize Africa, and to improve the quality of lives for the people of Africa. And within all those 5 priority areas, you cannot achieve that without integrating gender. So gender is critical component in achieving the high 5s. And at the moment in the bank, we have an opportunity to see how best we can bring in gender, especially gender indicators, in these high 5s, because we are developing new strategies. And it's an opportunity to inform the development of those strategies for colleagues in operations, like the New Deal on energy in Africa. And we have, sometimes you face pushbacks. But what we have done in the bank is that we have, I think also the African Development Bank is unique in the sense that it's the only MDB that has appointed a special envoy on gender. Mm-hmm. And when Ban Ki-moon appoints a special envoy, it means that there's a crisis situation. And the bank recognized that gender mainstreaming was a crisis, so the former president of the bank appointed Geraldine Moleketi-Fraser. And I can say that over the past 3 years, gender mainstreaming and the profile of gender in the bank has really been elevated. Also thanks to the executive directors in the board. Now you cannot take a project to the board without addressing gender. In fact, you do that, your project will be returned back. So directors are now aware and conscious of the fact that if they don't take gender into consideration in the design of their projects, that would have consequences when they go to the board. But having said that, I think there's still a lot that we need to do in the bank in terms of our monitoring and evaluation, impact evaluation as well, on how we're mainstreaming gender and getting gender results and gender outcomes. Most of what we do at the bank is, as Sonoma said, is at the quality at entry, the readiness review, we struggle at the project completion level to see what are the clear gender outcomes of a bank project. And I think with the gender marker system that we want to put in place, it will help us to address some of these issues, particularly in fragile and post-conflict countries.
Thanks very much. Karen, it's come up this morning that Megan and I, mainly Megan, went through what we could figure out about what the World Bank was doing in projects in gender. And there are databases, and we found some stuff, but we also found it was hard to find everything, put it that way, particularly when it came to what particular project, what kind of components projects were putting in with gender elements, sort of that level of detail. I am told, by you amongst others, that this data is going to get better. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I want to perhaps come to that question with a few preface remarks. So the first is that the World Bank Group, as you heard this morning, approved a new gender strategy in December. And there are two things that I think are different about this strategy than the approach that was followed in the past that has implications for gathering data and for monitoring and tracking. So the two preface comments are first that I really, as an academic, I love the word gender, and as a person who works in the bank, I hate the word gender, and I would like to abolish it from the lexicon. And the reason I say that is because I think it obscures what we really are always talking about. I encounter far too many people, and this was the case when I was at USAID as well as the bank. Gender is a code, it's a shorthand, but I don't always know what people mean when they use it. So you talk about a gender outcome. I don't know what the outcome actually is. You talk about, and I'm not saying this is not critical of you, Basil, because this is prevalent all over my institution. People talk about gender considerations. I don't actually know what that means. So what I would really like to do, and what we've tried to do through this strategy, is to actually name the gap that exists between males and females in the national economy, in the particular sector, at the country level, that is relevant that we're trying to close. What that means then is that we are trying to move away from generic mainstreaming. That's another term, perhaps as an academic, I sort of liked, but as a practitioner, I also detest. Because as Karen Matheson said, it means you do a little bit of everything, but it doesn't get you to the result that you're trying to achieve. And through this new strategy, we're trying to actually identify the results in plain, concrete English, and then figure out how we get there. So that means a wholesale change in thinking about a monitoring and a tracking system. And the difficulty for us as a bank is we have a system. By the way, I think the ADB system is a great system, and I've long, as Sonomi knows, have really long admired and championed it since they implemented it in 1999. But different institutions, as she also said, have their own internal approaches. And so we have an internal approach that we have to still work with as we figure out how we get to a new approach. And the bank is trying to do a few things as part of the strategy, which will be rolling out from July going forward, and some of my colleagues in the room are working on this. We have what's a new tag, which is trying to get us to identify more about more than just whether the project, the activity, the loan, the technical assistance has an analysis, has actions in the activity that respond to the analysis, and whether or not they're indicators in a results framework, to actually helping us articulate what is the result. And whether there's a results chain in the activity that drives toward that. And that's a complicated thing to do in systems. And we have to do that, obviously, at the activity, at the concept note stage. You have to have the right kind of questions at the during implementation. And then, like the ADB, we're putting in place what's new for us, a rating for how well the project closed a gender gap that was identified as the gap to close by the time the project ends. So we're rolling out this new system that's trying to be a new integrated system in July, and it will be a work in progress. And that information is internal. That is actually not what's reported externally. So I think there's a little bit of a disconnect between what we monitor and track and the information that we have versus what goes out to the world. So for the world, the corporate scorecard, which Karen mentioned, is actually an important vehicle. Our corporate scorecard has 3 tiers. The first are outcome variables, outcome indicators of things like, adolescent fertility rates, the gender gap the gap between males and females in access to finance, measured by the proportion, for instance, of women who have bank accounts. Those are things that countries, that all institutions, all development actors contribute to. So those are real higher order. Then the second tier of the scorecard is sort of the output level. And then the third level is more about our process. And as part of this strategy, we're changing all of those. Not all, but we're trying to improve on the indicators in those levels.
So I could ask, why isn't your new tagging system going to be public?
Well, part of it is, I think this is an important issue. I hope at some point it will be, but some of it is proprietary information with governments, and you can't make information available at sensitive stages of loan negotiations or those kinds of things. But I think at some point when we get, particularly for the ICR system, the completion rating, that will be. And I think that will be important. Also, I should say, this is true of all of our institutions. We consider ourselves one institution, but we're like lots of mini institutions in an institution. Sure. So when we do these systems, we have to talk to and negotiate with our colleagues in the independent evaluation group. We have to work with what's called, I forgot even the initials, OPCS, operational something or other. We have to work with all of our colleagues in our global practices who own the substance. So all of, bringing this together is a hugely interesting negotiated process within the institution. And getting people to buy in and do it, it will be important. And we hope that they will, along the lines of what Andy or someone said this morning, or Michaela. If they do it, it will make the project better. And it will make the outcome better. And it will be a better outcome for our partners, our clients, whether it's the IFC client in the private sector or our government client. So we have to do this with them.
Sure. To the point of how important it is to work with OPCS, in an institution that has gone through...
Can you tell me the acronym?
Operational Policy and Core Services. There you go.
Thank you.
But the reason I know that is because I used to work in the World Bank 7 years ago. It is a sign of a strength of OPCS that it still has the same acronym as it did then. Everybody else has changed their acronyms. Clearly, it runs the entire institution. Tracy, we've been talking about data, and you said something interesting before we came in. I assume that we need more and better data. It seems to have been a line thrown around a lot this morning. You suggested you might have a slightly different view.
Well, I do. Well, first of all, thank you, CGD and Mayra and Charles. I have to tell you, I recently went to the board. I'm going to come back to that in March. And literally, for the first time in 28 years at the bank, yes, if you're doing any calculations, I started when I was 13 years old. And anyway, I actually use the word, this is really cool. And I don't think I've ever used the word cool. I also use the expression, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But then I debunked that because you can. And I'll come back to that in a second. But I do have to tell you, before coming here, I was really struck and I was reflecting. And I hope Mayra and Meg Berger, our dear friends, and Andy can appreciate this. So I've been in the bank literally 28 years and started in operations, started actually in evaluation, then went to operations, did programming, did it on the ground in Brazil, came back, worked in corporate, went down to Uruguay. So I've kind of been all over. And I can remember there was something in the IDB when you're working on projects called, and I'll do it in Spanish, cultura de párrafo, which means the paragraph culture. Meaning, somebody said women in development. Remember when it was women in development? Yeah. How weird is that if you think about it? But it's like, that's important. So whatever loan you're doing, you have to write something really compelling and interesting, but actually means nothing, and you're not dedicating any resources to it. So I remember, so I kind of think, well, we've really come a long way in going from the cultura de párrafo to actually beginning to measure stuff. And I think, before we were happy with how many men and women benefited from this road project? Yippee. And now it's kind of like, and one of the things I think supports this, by the by, is, yes, it's been on our books as policies and strategies, and quite frankly, we have done some impact evaluation work. Sometimes there's a little disconnect, but it feeds into it. That does help because it gives you people like me in the strategy department to say, you haven't done this. And so the accountability, corporate scorecard, making those public helps. But I think one of the things is also pushing the envelope in terms of, well, it's no longer good to just get sex disaggregated beneficiaries. I want to know, did you actually do anything? And one of the things that the bank had implemented in 2008, which was our development effectiveness framework, and among other things, that's the whole tools, the quality at entry, project monitoring, project completion, and impact evaluations. And one of the things, and probably why any of my colleagues here, you hate us, that acronym, they don't like us, because every project that goes to the board has to go through an independent review by our team. And basically they say, looking at the vertical logic, did you actually do anything to empower women, or are you just kind of window dressing? So that and you get ranked on it. And I think, I forget who said it earlier this morning, I think there is this incentive, you want to be the straight A student, right? So I want to do everything, and maybe not everything in this backdrop of huge budget constraints. Maybe you don't have to do it all the time. I think I agree with what Karen and somebody said, that the mainstreaming always isn't the best way we want to do it. But going back to, kind of the data thing, and by the way, with our update to the institutional strategy approved last March, our team updated our corporate results framework. And I want to tell you, speaking of a negotiated process across about 18 months and various divisions, and kind of the common echo was, we don't have data. Oh, no, you can't make this mandatory. And Andy was my champion in battling. You can't make this mandatory. We're like, yeah, you can. You can make it mandatory. Well, anyway, so Paola Castillo of my team, in basically 4 months, developed a couple of cool tools based on part of what we do is monitor client perceptions, right? So we have an external feedback survey. And we're kind of like thinking, well, we got 4 years of this data now. Can we do anything with it? So point number one is we have data. We may not be leveraging it as much as we can. Among ourselves, or within our institutions and among them. I'll come back to that. So anyway, we're thinking, well, let's take a look and find out what all these different external feedback providers said. And maybe let's introduce just a couple of questions. For example, how important is gender equality and empowerment in your country? Well, not surprisingly, or maybe it is surprisingly, over 80% of the high-level officials, these are ministries of planning and ministers of finance, said it is very important. Hey, cool. And then would you consider introducing a component in your loan? Yeah, roughly 40% said that. The number one thing, however, what they wanted, good news, and we're going to have to follow up on with this, Mayra and Charles, impact evaluations. So the one comment made this morning is, are we making the compelling business case, not among ourselves, not at the board, enough of that? Are you, when you're sitting down in Montevideo or you're in Rio de Janeiro, are you making that compelling business case to whoever who is sitting on the other side of the table? And that, I'm afraid, is still, we've got a long way to go on that. But anyway, going back to this study we did, so it's kind of, let's use this EFS data, the partner data, but can we look at kind of what else we've said? And quickly, they developed a text algorithm that basically kind of lets you, in this case, download 2,000 documents of all kind of SG loans, all TCs, our sector framework documents.
Don't use your acronyms. What's a TC?
Sorry, I'm sorry. A technical cooperation. I'm sorry. You're right. Technical cooperation. Somebody could make a whole lot of money if they just made a glossary of all of these and made us use the same words. So our technical cooperation, our strategy documents, they also used it to look at national development plans in Latin America and the Caribbean. They used it to look at, are there targets in these national development plans for gender? So anyway, we got all of this, and within an hour and 25 minutes, downloaded this, searched for kind of how are terms related to each other. So, and they're like, well, who cares if they mention it? Well, they also then did a subsequent study that if you mention it, the likelihood of getting a higher, a positive development outcome in that operation is true. So we figured that's a good proxy. The other thing they did is let's just kind of search what data is out there. And I'm glad you mentioned, Charles, about World Banks, because we found out and actually built a gender dashboard using API-enabled data from the World Bank and
API?
I said API-enabled data.
What is API?
Oh, sorry. You're tough. Accessible, just you can say it, dear. Clearly, I don't know. API, it's application program interface. So it's really techie words, but basically it's free data and allows you to use it and pull it in. So we have it from the World Bank, and thank you, Clinton Foundation, for the No Ceilings initiative. We got a lot of data there. We're looking at our own databases. We have about 66. But basically, it puts it together in a really easy format. They did about 700 lines of code, wrote this thing up, and made a very simple dashboard, 3 big graphs. It's in Tableau. It's easy to use. And you say, I'm working in Colombia, and I want to see what indicators are there. They normalize the data and say, basically, where Colombia is doing fairly well in gender and where it's not. So you'll see things like women, let's say I want to look about, or transport. You'll see women being trained in engineering. So you'll see that. You'll see the indicator tracked over time, and then how you compare with any countries in the world you want to see it. So bottom line, and we've gone through, actually, our executive vice president, who's a big champion, Julie Katzman, we presented it to all the technical teams, and our vice president, Santiago Levy, for sectors, was saying, use it. Let's go into the granularity, use this data. And then the other thing they did was also looking at social media. Now, caveats there, we get it, but part of that is, again, looking at budget constraints. It's you're finding out who's saying what and when they're saying it. Who are the influencers in these countries? And we did five case studies. And now, to place kind of, getting the word out, what Andy and his team particularly have done, the great work, you know who's talking. You know who you can pinpoint that message to. So I think I agree that there is still a data challenge, particularly in certain countries and in certain sectors, the let's say, social sectors, but it's not as bad as I think people perceive it to be.
Tracy, you've moved the discussion in an interesting way, and I want to keep on going in that direction. You've started talking about country data rather than MDB data, if you will. Yeah. MDBs hugely important. The World Bank particularly important. It still has some of my pension money in it. But they are, 0.something% of the investment portfolio in most of the countries of the world. They're bit players in the most generous sense of the term. Very important bits, but bit players. And the real trick here is, how do we mainstream / integrate / whatever these issues and these concerns and this evaluation and this data at the country level? How are you all doing on that?
Maybe I can. We have a new gender data portal, hugely important for the World Bank, recommended to everybody. And we also just have something called the Little Gender Data Book, which was just reissued. This is the fourth one. The portal takes data from all over, and reputable, reliable data. One of the things that's great about this gender data portal is it shows you where we have gender data gaps. That's right. And that's really critical. And we are so happy to work with Mayra, Buvinic, and the IDB, and the ADB, and Africa Development Bank in Data 2X in particular, to come together to help fill key gender data gaps, which we have to do at the country level. Now, we've prioritized in our work just 2 of the 16 gender data gaps that Mayra and her team have identified as critical for monitoring SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And where I see it's completely urgent is the filling of what we know about male-female ownership over, access to, and control over land, housing, finance, and technology, critical physical and financial assets. Also, critical is filling gender data gaps around work, paid work, unpaid work, the productivity and the returns to that work is just absolutely essential. Those are critical for any country development outcomes, and we just don't yet have enough data. And countries, I love this phrase that Ela Bhatt, founder of Self-Employed Women's Association in India, used many, many years ago. If it's not measured, it's not visible. And if countries don't see where the gaps are between men and women in these domains, it means that they may not put their resources in the right place. So gender data is key. I'm thrilled that the Gates Foundation has moved in this direction. They've made an $80 million commitment, $40 million of which is to fill gender data gaps. But this is a critical partnership enterprise for the public sector, but also the private sector. And I mentioned the private sector here too, because this is one of the partnerships we're trying to stimulate, getting banks, for instance, to report sex disaggregated information on their clients. And it's part of, as somebody said, knowing your customer base. But many businesses have an incentive to collect. Now the question is, how do we aggregate and get that information standardized in ways that we could use it, not just for a particular company, but more broadly?
Okay. Yeah, in ADB we use the World Bank portal. That's
great. That's cost effective.
Yeah, I mean, you know, yeah, I mean, you cover globally. So, in the case of SDGs, we have started not really the data collection, but for Asia Pacific, together with UN Women, we have started working on benchmarking of what data is available, where the source is, what's not available, what's missing. So in order to help out all the Asia Pacific countries in understanding where they stand now, what more they need to do. So that's on the statistics and data side. The other side, of course, is that there's a thematic analysis of what more we need to do, what are the transformative gender factors. So that's one element in terms of the country level data support. We also support the EDGE. What does EDGE stand for?
Evidence and Data for Gender Equality, which is managed by UN Statistics with UN Women, and all of us as part of that.
Right. So for that. But I wanted to go back to the project. It's a country level data, but in terms of the project, ADB financed lending portfolios, gender equality results. How are we tracking that, and how we? Because every donor and at the board of ADB asked this question. So in year 2015, how many women and girls were supported and access to education or access to having a training or agriculture extension? We actually do the aggregation of that based on the project completion report. So I just wanted to inform you because, you know, there's a major. What's the point in doing that? I don't know, but we're actually saying this because continuously we are showing this to the board and then see this is what we are doing. But do you think is it worth it to continue? Because each year the data really, you can't really compare the data across different years and across different countries. But we do have that internal database, and it actually really helps us in making sure that we continue to collect that data during the implementation, because if you don't track this data during the project implementation, you're never going to get it at the project completion.
Actually, Charles, let me jump in. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, no, so country level, and again, I'm kind of putting my hat on, sitting on the ground, and what would I be doing? I think am I on? Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So one thing I think is weird is actually in the preparation of our country strategies or country partnership frameworks, right? And I think there's a sequencing issue because I don't know how compelling we truly are at convincing, you know, we do our diagnostics and saying these are the areas in which your most pressing development challenges are, and here's where we think we can leverage our comparative advantage to help you solve them. I think it's at that point, because I don't think we're as convincing as we could be saying that it's got to be there. And so that our borrowing member countries aren't looking at this, oh, it's another cost of doing business with the IDB. They're making me say something about gender or climate or institutional capacity building, right? Our three cross-cutting themes. So I think there's one. Two, I also think, kind of what's out there in terms of country level data. I don't think we've begun to even scratch the surface on tapping knowledge in country and universities that have done impact evaluations or even partnering up. Local universities, if they were to say, hey, can we partner with CGD and
the MDB community. Can you imagine what a boost it would be for that particular university? So I think we have not kind of exhausted all possibilities of, again, what data is there, or at least what skills are there. And you don't have to have a full-blown impact evaluation. It doesn't, and this is what we're talking with Mayra earlier on. I still think that, again, at the time when you're discussing the country strategy and also your annual programming process, do you actually have to have data from that particular country? I know there are differences, but is there a way we couldn't control for certain country-specific variables to actually say, this is why this makes sense? This is why you want to build your road with better lighting so that you don't have women getting caught at night by themselves in a dark area or something like that. And I feel like there's a lot of ad hoc, but we need to bring it together, and I don't think that's that difficult. But I think it's making us much more compelling. And then the final thing kind of on the country level, we did this way back when, Mayra, you may remember this in Andes. So this was in 1996. 1996. We got a request from the government of Uruguay, Ministry of Interior, for a crime and violence prevention program. And it was basically, it evolved a lot. It was a lot of kind of bricks and mortar stuff, and we changed that around. And as part of that, we'd like to do a victimization survey for women. What? This is Uruguay. We're like the Switzerland of South America. And why would we do that? We convinced him. We paid for it, by the way. We convinced him and did 600 case studies, face-to-face interviews. And the result came out around 40% of women had suffered either physical or psychological violence. And I have to tell you, the Minister of Interior, once he saw that, immediately became the champion. This was during Project Design, by the way. Went to public events, talked about this, and I think you sometimes just need one champion there, and maybe an unlikely champion, right? And that's why I agree, kind of the gender champions. No, just one that's going to kind of make sense of it. So I think there are a couple of kind of quick measures that we can implement now to really kind of spur that in at the country level.
Yeah, I think for the African Development Bank, we are working with our Bureau of Statistics at the country level. And you will recall that in 2015, the African Union declared 2015 as the year of women economic empowerment and development towards Agenda 2063. And well, thanks to the head of the AU being a woman, she said that we need a gender scorecard on economic empowerment for women and to develop an index that will be presented to African heads of state. And the African Union Commission, the African Development Bank, and the United Nations Economic Commission of Africa came together to develop a scorecard, which was presented to African heads of state in terms of how well they're doing on women economic empowerment. And there was an award ceremony to different components and on the women economic empowerment given to countries that are doing well in terms of empowering women in their economies. For this year, the theme for the AU Summit is on human rights with special emphasis on the rights of women. And we're also doing a gender scorecard looking at how countries are implementing human rights in particular to the rights of women in African countries. So at the next African Union Heads of State Summit in July, there's also going to be a scorecard which is going to be presented to African heads of state. I think that is one way that the three regional bodies are working together in terms of using country-level data to present it and inform policymakers and African heads of state. In addition to that, we also have the community of practice, the African community of practice on financing for gender results. I think there's a global practice that is led by the World Bank. And at our last annual meeting, the finance ministers, we were talking about financial inclusion, and they said that we should come up with an index on how countries in Africa are doing in terms of financial inclusion for women. And I think so this is one way of using country-generated data to inform and influence policy so that countries know how well they are doing in terms of gender, the gender agenda. The final one that we are also looking at is for working with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and the AFDB to have an Africa Gender Index, which we'll be doing every 2 years to show progress that African countries are making in terms of their gender agenda. But I think the mere fact that, at the level of the heads of state, they are open to the idea of having a gender scorecard which tracks how well countries are doing. I think that's a welcome development.
While we're on the subject of sort of bespoke to general, if you will, I wonder about evaluation within MDB finance projects. At the moment, we've got some lovely RCTs going on, which are fantastic and producing great data and hopefully results that we hope generalize. Although, let's be honest, the evidence is that RCT results don't always generalize, and perhaps in particular when you're dealing with things that are deeply socially and institutionally embedded, gender. So, there's a challenge there. This is a great first step, but clearly where we'd all like to end up is basically having enough data available generally that rather than having to go through a specific exercise of collecting data at baseline, running the LCT, then going out and specifically for this project collecting data again at the other end, and then running the results and then rerunning the results and then going through the review process, and then by the time everybody's dead it gets into the American Economic Review. Having a process that's a bit more kind of rapid and systematized than that. Is it too much to ask of the MDBs to play a role in pushing us in that direction?
I don't think it's too much to push. And again, I think that makes a good point, because you're right. By the time you finish an average sovereign guarantee and loan operation, and you evaluate it, and you feed it back, and you present it, I mean, we're all off to other places, shall we say. So it's not really feeding back. And the earlier panel mentioned it, and I guess that's I think would be interesting is, what can we take advantage of already now to be able to start, again, being a little bit more selective about what really should deserve an RCT. What can be done just, in the different types, using different types of evaluation methodologies, and what, quite frankly, can we just say, there is compelling evidence in other parts of the world that we think this would fit or something. I think just earlier on, but I think it's doable. I think it is important, and we can do it.
I think one of the things that is important, I think we have to make distinctions about, again, different types of data and collection methods and the purpose for which we collect and then we use them. I think having country-level data on a basic set of phenomena is just essential, just essential. And those are really important for diagnosing the key gender gaps in a sector within a country or in a particular geographic granularity and so forth, just for basic things. But then when you get to the project level, you often need a different type of data and information. And one of the things, I mean, I appreciate the intent of your question, but context matters. It always matters. So a degree of granularity in terms of certain kinds of context, the institutional configuration, the norms, the stickiness of some of the social relations, you're always going to need that. And in this context, I was a skeptic, and I'm more of a fan of RCTs, random control design. I'm a huge fan of evaluation. The bank has the Gender Innovation Labs started by Marcus Goldstein in Africa, mentioned earlier this morning. We have 50 impact evaluations underway in Africa, but across the bank, just through these labs, that doesn't include these other impact evaluations. We have 75. So one of the things that I've noticed, and Mayra and I have had this conversation, because she has a companion project that was funded by ExxonMobil, is what we haven't done as an impact evaluation community is to together identify some of the key questions about what works, and specifically in the domain of economic empowerment, whether it's entrepreneurship and how you create them, women-owned businesses in the small and medium space, whether it's about transitions of young women to different types of employment and how you break occupational sex segregation, whether it's about how you level the field in agriculture and reduce the input productivity gap between male and female farmers, as a community identifying those questions and then having impact evaluations in different contexts for different types of approaches with enough both commonality and variation that you can get to that. And that is my goal through the strategy at the bank of having actually a federated system of labs that use impact evaluation, some RCT, but not necessarily, often with some kind of a counterfactual or control group, to be able to actually upfront identify what the questions are and then collect data in different contexts, to be able to at least say we can answer some questions, but we always know through impact evaluations there will be more questions
That's right.
to be answered about what works. And the other thing that I think is important, it's to learn about what works and what doesn't. So from just one quick example, in the field of enterprise development, there's a lot of impact evaluation already about training and different business training. How many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars have been put into business development training? And actually, we know a lot about what doesn't work there because that's what the impact evaluations. But now we have to figure out what does work if you change the design. So that's where we need to go.
Just one more question before I open up to the floor, and you've all been very patient. On this point of what doesn't work, we're not evaluating the project, we're not evaluating as much the projects that say they're doing nothing about gender. Are we thereby hiding a bunch of projects that are actually doing bad things in the gender space?
Yeah.
And if so, what can we do about that?
We're not close, except for through safeguards monitoring. We're not really looking at what bad the project has done. The assumption is a good design is supposed to have already sorted out in terms of addressing the negative impacts. For example, when the state-owned enterprises privatized, then in terms of the labor impact, and then there's supposed to have been the mitigation measures. So how has that been addressed? Yeah, but I think the problem is we really don't have that kind of information. Does not systematically come into the center in our place, which is the gender police, right? But we really need a systematic approach actually, instead of waiting until the project completes.
One of the things that we're trying to do at the African Development Bank is to systematically develop country gender profiles that would be accompanied when we're doing our country strategy paper, so that you can have a clear gender lens in terms of what are the gender issues, the key gender issues that are happening in the country. I think I agree with Karen, context matters. And for MDBs, we need a lot of collaboration rather than sort of doing some of these things individually. Analytical work that feed into the design of project is very important. You look at with the MDBs, we have when you look at the appraisal reports, we have a section on lessons learned, and which should feed into the design of the new project that we are developing. But in most cases, you have these lessons learned and it's taken into consideration. The independent evaluation unit looks at projects and programs and make recommendations. But when it comes to the actual implementation and the developing of the new project, sometimes task managers will just put it there because it's a requirement. But when it comes to the actual implementation, we go back to square one. So I think those are some of the challenges that we need to look at when we want to do this type of issues on using data. Yeah.
You want to come in?
Just two quick things. One of the things I think is really important about impact evaluations, which is what the labs do, they're embedded with project teams. And that is really critical because it means real-time learning. Of course, you're going to do the econometrics, and of course, you have to wait to have data. But this real-time learning and being embedded in teams with task team leaders, feeding the information of the baseline, the implementation, these early results is critical. And I think the other thing that's critical from a bank perspective is being embedded with teams is important because people change jobs.
That's right.
And so if as you know, and so if you've been part of an impact evaluation on a transport project in Morocco and you end up going somewhere else, you at least bring that learning with you to the next opportunity. The other thing I think is important is that I do think it's important to bring projects that are designed without a gender lens do have impacts, differential impacts on men and women. Often, not always, but often. And I do think it's important to evaluate those types of projects for what impact they have. But the other thing that I don't think we always do, which is what I would like to move to in the next world, is to say, if you have an understanding of the existing state of gender inequalities and where the gaps are, and you have a gender-blind project, how would you understand how those existing gender relations influence the success or the outcome of that project or not? And I think that's a really, and part of that, the way of asking that question, if you have a sense of what the existing inequalities or gaps are, maybe we can actually bring a different lens to the design, and that will help us get to the business case that people are also talking
Charles,
about.
one quick question on what doesn't work. I do have to kind of give a shout out. My team is kind of fuzzy because we're releasing our development effectiveness overview every year. 2 years ago, we started to actually call a chapter failures. And I have to tell you, it met with a lot of resistance. Like, what? I had lessons learned, but failures? And I have to say, and it was kind of a game changer. And one of the things, and by the way, we're having that same discussion. But one of the things I think was useful is really, and again, part of it is coming from our board and from our independent evaluation office, but it's like, look, evaluation isn't just about accountability, it is about learning, gotta kind of refresh that every now and again. But the other thing is, I think what's interesting, keeping those, and there are a lot of people that are interested in doing the impact evaluations or just monitoring evaluation in general. So we do include these stories. Claudia Pires is one of our major authors, and so that comes in the document and it is made public with the author's title there. So that does create a little bit of I think it does a little, maybe not, Claudia, incentive to kind of get that work out there, because a lot of people are like, oh, I'm not getting there's no incentive for me to do this. Having said that, that's another myth I wanted to debunk about impact evaluations. Clients don't want it. So from 2008 at the IDB, 12% of the sovereign guaranteed loan operations approved in 2008 had an impact evaluation, not necessarily an RCT, but some sort of an impact evaluation. Last year, that number went up to about 46%. So now, granted, some are being financed by loan resources, so countries are interested in this, yay. A lot of them are being financed with our measly little amounts of trust funds. But my point is, it's getting done. And I think, stop looking up in Washington and in Manila and now you're back in Abidjan. And, kind of let's think, well, what's meaningful and what's going on, on the ground. So if there's this sea tide of interest at the country level, let's build on that. And, again, I think it's this capacity building, take the universities, take the think tanks, our institutions. And by the way, I don't know if you all know, the MDBs have had in place a memorandum of understanding to actually help build statistics systems in countries. I don't know how well we've done on that, quite frankly. But I guess the point is, this should be in our borrowing member countries and private sector clients' best interests. And I don't think we've really done as much as we could on building that capacity.
Let me admit to a failure as a moderator before I get evaluated, which is I gave away my one timepiece. I am hoping somebody will wave at me madly when we should be wrapping up. But let us open to questions before that point. Right here.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Segero. I'm president of a non-profit called Hope for Tomorrow and a profit company called Segero's International Group. I'm the frequent of World Bank Spring and Annual Meeting, and I was happy to meet with the president of the African Development Bank. Thank you so much for your high five. So looking at your high five and your new initiative, and to all of you, I'm looking at Feed Africa. Feed Africa, we have the actual people that are to be fed, who are on the ground over there and who do much work on the ground. How do you look at involving like the SMEs, small farmers, for themselves in the rural area, working with the civil society, working with private sector, and working with the actual farmers? How do you include us into the high five to make things happen and fight the poverty by ourselves? And so how do we work? And all of you too, how do we integrate and collaborate and partner public partnership for poor people. How do we do it? So thank you.
And we know there is a gender element to that question because of who does most of the small farming in Africa. But,
Yeah.
thank you very much. Thank you, Mayra. Sorry, thank you, Mayra.
Thanks. Yes, I mean, the question is around, really picks up on, Tracy, what you were saying about how you work with other stakeholders, maybe partners and suppliers. So my question is quite specific, is increasing recognition of the importance of procurement as a driver for women's economic empowerment. We know that that's in the mix with the high-level panel. All of you publish, all of your development banks, you publish your procurement tenders with UN Development Business, right? We're, the Commonwealth Business Women's Network, we're working with UN Development Business to ensure there's much more visibility about those tenders amongst businesswomen, most of whom we've never heard of UN Development Business. UN Development Business, to this day, do not have sex disaggregated data. We all know that. So my question is, how can we work with other stakeholders in the chain to ensure that the data is improved at a basic level, but also picking up on what I think, Karen, you were saying, it's not just about the sex disaggregated data, what else can they do? So it's really using your multiplier effect. All of you have huge multiplier effect to take that conversation forward, which is what we need. Interested in your response.
And one more, and then we'll come to the panel.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you again. No, I needed both.
My name is Paula Castillo. I work at the IDB, and just picking up on something else that Tracy said about how a lot of the data is in the countries. We had the pleasure of hearing Patricio Gutierrez from the University of Chile talk about how there's a lot of data embedded already within governments and institutions within governments, particularly microdata, geolocation data. So I wanted to know whether there are efforts to map this information, what kind of information there are, because there's very, very granular data, including not only gender information, but, for example, about ethnicity, income, and, well, thank you.
So three very different questions, but on agriculture, on UNDP, and on getting data out of governments. Anybody?
Yeah, I think for the Feed Africa, maybe what I would just like to refer to is that we are setting up a facility for women. It's called the Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa. It's called AFAWA. And my colleague Anne, sitting there with Lynette, is leading on that. And one of the things that we want to do is to unlock lending to women at the bottom of the pyramid, women in SMEs, because one of the key challenges that women SMEs face is access to finance. So the president of the bank just launched at our last annual meeting this affirmative finance action for women in Africa that would provide financial resources, not just the financing, but also looking at the ecosystem, the technical assistance component, looking at the regulatory environment on how best we can reform some of our regulations that would allow women to own land, which they can use as a collateral, and also to have a knowledge component. So maybe what we can do, Madam Sonama, is if you see my colleague Anne, she can even share with you a presentation on the AFAWA facility that we are setting up in the bank to support women in agriculture and women in SMEs.
I'll just answer the first two questions. In terms of how to involve the civil society or the smallholders or the micro-entrepreneurs, female micro-entrepreneurs, one of the typical thing what we do is to support the self-help groups among the rural women, for example. I mean, they need the whole series of comprehensive type of training, including their life skills development, and also networking across different entrepreneurs, micro to small entrepreneurs led by women. These have been proven very useful and effective, and feeling them feel empowered, but at the same time having mobilized themselves to demand access to the training opportunities that are provided by the projects or the government or any other private sector services. Now, in terms of the procurement, since we are a big infrastructure bank, this is a very crucial point, and this is one thing that I really learned about the providing more access and then perhaps quota system or targets for women-led enterprises to have access to the procurement. And I've been really impressed by in the last 2 days of this whole discussion about this in the MDB summit. So this is one thing that the Asian Development Bank has not been doing. We've been focusing more on the individual opportunities for to have access to jobs as construction workers, but not on this particular part. So something to take back home and start working on.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely brilliant. And I think there are a couple of things just come to mind. I think first of all, yeah, a lot of people don't know, if you've not done operational work, you don't know what UNDP is. So I think kind of the visualization and getting the message out there is like, here's what you all have done. An event, something like this, by first of all examining, and I know I probably will get a lot of flack for this, but looking at kind of everybody's procurement policies to see, well, are you really putting where your mouth is and doing anything about it? Are you giving points in your when you're doing the evaluation of a particular bid, if you are encouraging gender, if you are, sorry, we're not going to just focus on gender, but are you looking at a life cycle project of, for an infrastructure project for 50 years? So the sustainability dimension comes in, and I think we're a little bit antiquated on that. I think we all need to revisit those procurement policies with what our own governors approved in our own strategies and policies. So yes. Two, I think getting kind of folks around there and saying, because nobody, it's like, well, I'll do it if World Bank does it, and I'll, So we kind of like, let's get it out there. First thing is admitting you have a problem is getting it out there, and then kind of looking at it and seeing how you could track that a little bit better, and again maybe kind of looking at which countries themselves want to promote that. Years ago there was always kind of, well, you got extra points if you had a local provider. Well, just tweak that. You get even more points if it is a woman-owned business or an indigenous person's-owned business or something like that. And I think, that's a great idea, and I think we should run with it with our procurement policies. Oh, one last thing too. I think it's also because of our procurement policies are approved by our boards, and because we share the same shareholders. But let's face it, those same shareholders don't always act the same way in each of our boards.
Exactly.
So I think it might be interesting, again, having kind of this dialogue, this conversation, so it's not, it's a non-borrower imposed. So I think that's where we need, and that kind of a backdoor approach to it could also really be a nice forum to saying, this is why this makes sense. You're getting better bang for your development buck by including women. So. By the way, are these, what is it, the Vegas rules here? You be quoting me on that?
Chatham House.
Chatham House, yeah, that's right. Chatham House, yeah.
Sorry, no.
No.
My name is Emmanuel. I'm a member of a board trust of a nonprofit organization. I was looking through the papers, handouts which we've been given, and there is a reference to international organizations, intergovernmental and nonprofit international organizations who have been doing decades of work on this issue. So, and on the other side, there is this MDBs, all that, working towards gender parity, towards promotion. So, and at one point there was mention of this data, and it's been said that data is very important, collection, evaluation, so that to blueprint the way forward. So I was thinking, instead of reinventing the wheel, the data should be there. If there are international organizations who have been working for decades, how would the MDPs, do they make use of this? Do they coordinate, use the data which is on the ground to take actions? So how does it relate? How do the MDPs relate with international, like the UN and all that stuff? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Collaboration, not just amongst yourselves, yes. Back there, and then, sorry, I missed this lady up here after that. Sorry.
Sure, thanks. My name is Algerline Gill. I'm a monitoring evaluation officer with the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And I wanted to ask a question related to Karen's comment that we should evaluate differential impacts on men and women, even for projects that aren't designed with a gender lens. I think that's a very interesting question, and there are ways to do it sort of without spending a lot of extra money, but there are also ways to really dig into intra-household dynamics and things like that. And I'm just wondering what you have in mind when you recommend evaluating those issues, and how, given the resource constraints we discussed in the earlier panel, how you decide how much money to spend looking into those kinds of questions.
Is it on?
Yeah.
I'm Denise Noel de Beek from the Caribbean Development Bank. I just wanted to support two things. One, the drive to support country systems, particularly in our small island development states. We are a regional bank, very small, but it's very important that we do the kind of collaboration that I just heard about. Just to bring to your attention that there's a development partners task force on statistics, and a specific committee in the Caribbean that is working, coordinating a body of work on specific issues based on the needs that the borrowing member countries identify. So I think it's also very important, as particularly because these countries have just engaged in an elaborate consultation on the SDGs and identified priorities, to be able to further do the collaboration around what are the gender needs that they really how are they going to target, how are they going to monitor gender across those selected SDGs that they have been doing, that they have decided on at the country level as well as the regional level. And we do have regional institutions that are involved, and from where I sit, they do need a lot of support. So I think that we should really attempt to collaborate in the Caribbean region to get better results for these countries. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Maybe I just want to address the differential, evaluating the differential impacts. There's this story of a water project in a rural setting where we know that women walk long distances to go fetch water from the stream. So it was decided to build a water point at the entrance of the village so that it will cut reduce women's time to go fetch water. The tap was built and everything was there, but yet still, because it's a patriarchal society, the women would still walk the 3-4 miles to go to the stream and get water. And the project designers decided to find out from the women, why are they not using the standpipe or walking long distances to go get water? And it turned out that 2 hours was the only time they had for a girl-to-girl discussion to be able to, be who they are. And sometimes I think this is where this differential impact come into focus. So that's a very good question that you have raised, and the projects also have different impacts, whether it's an infrastructure project, whether it's a social project, and these are some of the things that needs to be taken into consideration.
So the point about Basil's, I think, narrative here is that obviously you need consultation at the beginning of men and women for project design. Yes. And if the issue of time is not that you necessarily don't build the tap at the entrance to the village, but you put in place other mechanisms to enable women to have the kind of space that they need, and you find other ways in discussion with them that would meet their needs. So I think that was a really good example. On the question, the international institutions that, like the World Bank, that are main repositories of data, we collect this data from countries' own systems. We also run some of our standalone surveys. So we have a doing business survey or an enterprise survey that's run by the bank. But the household surveys are owned and run by the government, so the Uganda Bureau of Statistics or the National Statistics Offices. And we do have agreements and ways to share that data, the microdata, with other UN entities, which we do. We make that available, particularly, for instance, for the MDG monitoring. And likewise, there's ways, UNESCO, for instance, which is the repository for administrative data on enrollment rates and so forth. We have sharing systems that we report that. One of the challenges that we all face is the fact that that data may be amalgamated in different ways, and there may be different ways of reporting it publicly. in the microdata, there's often different weighting systems to get at representation. So digging into this can be quite complicated. And I'm really a believer in figuring out, but I think this is a hard political problem, and I think Mayra and others would agree who've been working on this, getting to harmonization across data systems is not an easy task, and I think it's really important that we do that. But we have to say that we have some agreements now. The SDG process with the indicators, the monitoring and tracking, we have important global working groups, and I'm hopeful that there will be the right kind of incentive structure and agreement that we can make progress on this issue, and some new platforms that are developing that will help.
Okay, quick yes/no poll then along the group. Are you happy with the SDG indicators for gender? Do you think they're,
No.
There we are. One last round of questions.
Hi, my name is Sandesh, and I'm a graduate student at American University studying economics. And I'm actually one of the students of Professor Karen Groen, and I actually can vouch for her passion for gender, and that she's a wonderful professor.
Did you already have your final exam?
She hasn't been graded yet.
What's the timing of this?
So since we're all talking about data and the problems that all of these big development organizations are having with data collection, so we are living in an age of social enterprises and lean methodologies to product development, or even there's a methodology called lean data collection, which is real-time data collection using technology and using all your customer touch points. So maybe in its most efficient form, it would be like stock exchange, and that would be so amazing. But I mean, since this is such a big problem, why don't we just stop at this point and really work on our like mechanisms for data collection? Maybe bring in like lean methodologies, and just for in the long run, since it's such a big problem in the long run, I think it would be very productive. So are you in any of these development organizations using the lean approaches or planning to use the lean approach towards data and using technology?
Okay, thanks. Wonderful timing, because according to Mayra's watch, you now have 1 minute to answer that question and say anything else you want to say, each.
We're doing some experimentation that I think is really important using digital technology and actually in collaboration with people who are looking at big data for how we actually can collect this information and use it, amalgamate it and use it to answer specific questions. But I have to say that unlike stock markets, we still have big questions of reliability and validation and other things that we have to pay attention to. But I think in 20 years or even less, 5 years, we're going to be in a much different place using data from electronic means.
I have some concern about the reliability of stock markets, but that's a different discussion.
Yeah, I agree, Charles. I think exactly this is what Paula and her team did. I mean, again, on the social media monitoring, developing a way to kind of find out what the conversations are and harnessing big data really through cheaper technologies. You have to be very careful, again, about what it's telling you, what you think it's telling you, and the time period over which it's telling you, right? So again, in this case, they harvested 1 million conversations. And by the way, in just 2 months, 25% of them were about gender, and of those, the overwhelming majority, 50% was about domestic or violence against women in Latin America and the Caribbean. No big surprise there. But it's like, well, okay, this was done over November, International Day for the Prevention of Violence Against Women. No wonder people are talking. But that's like, all right, so we didn't trust ourselves, and they did those annoying, I'm not going to use the acronym, interactive voice response phone calls, IVR. So they called 1 million households in the same countries that were served in 5 countries. And guess what? Same thing comes up. Number 1 issue in Latin America and the Caribbean is violence against women. So we felt a little bit better, but again, still very cautious of what this data is telling it. Any kind of, this big data and combining and, slicing and dicing, there are ways now to do it. Build these, specific types of tools that are, and by the way, this is also available. You can go look at our dashboard and our text algorithm and use it, and it's pretty easy to use. So we trained some folks from Andy's group in a morning. So I totally agree. That is the wave, and your group should champion us old dogs into that use of better technology.
I just wanted to go back to actually not that question, but the previous one, which was about partnership. How are we partnering outside of MDBs? And the partnerships are really, really crucial now. But I wanted to say that partnerships also follow where the resources are coming in.
That's right.
And that's really the realities. There's always a supply-driven elements in it, but I think it's really getting better because we are sort of having a more shared priorities in terms of data, in terms of tracking. So that's a good thing.
I mean, my former boss, the chief economist, was somebody who was very passionate using mobile technology to conduct interviews, and he saw it as a very cost-effective way than doing survey data. And maybe that's something that, but unfortunately he has left, and we're going to get a new chief economist. Maybe that is something that I might like to put across to him to see if we can use mobile technology in conducting surveys and collecting data at the country level.
Actually, there's been some work here at CGD by our colleague Ben Leo, looking at the reliability of mobile phone surveys in Africa and saying, actually, they seem to match up quite well with data from more expensive and traditional techniques. I want to thank this set of panelists and the last set of panelists for coming and talking to us this morning after what sounds like 2 really hard days of talking already for them. So thank you very much, and thank you, Andrew, for facilitating that. And I want to thank you all for coming to what I hope you found as fascinating as I did, discussion. It was a very CGD copacetic event, if you will, because the 2 big things I heard, maybe this is my bias as a development economist, but I heard 1, needs more research, and 2, it's all about the resources. Sounds about right to me, yeah. True of pretty much every topic, I'd say. But it is clearly a really exciting field at the moment, and what is going on in the MDBs is really exciting. They have come a long way very rapidly. There is a realization, as well there should be, that there is a long way to go, but we seem to be moving quite fast in the right direction. So that is all very exciting. One of the ways that it is clear we still have a long way to go, to come back to the resource point, is this figure of 1 to 3% of the budget going to these issues, I think, is indicative of the fact that while we've made progress, this is still something. I agree mainstreaming is a bad term, integrating may be better, but there is still some way to go. And that is clearly a role for all of us, not just the people on the stage and the people who were on the stage before, that we need to be pressuring these institutions to give more resources, to give more authority to the people we've heard speak this morning. And so I hope we all take that away with us. And thank you very much for coming.